Hello everyone, Sane Virtual here. Will Final Fantasy XI get a new reboot in 2022? All signs so far point to that yes, this could be a huge possibility. In August 2020, Final Fantasy XI received a new episodic story update called Voracious Resurgence, and if the title definition is anything to go by, this is indeed an unquenchable resurgence for Final Fantasy XI players who crave more story content. But let's dissect what Voracious Resurgence means for the future of the MMO. When Rhapsody's of Vana'diel was released, it was stated that this would be the last story update for Final Fantasy XI and the game will receive no more story updates. With that announcement and its conclusion, Final Fantasy XI was announced for a remake by Nexon to be reproduced as a mobile game. Unfortunately, the remake came with a lot of challenges, primarily internal issues within Nexon, that the Final Fantasy XI mobile remake was ultimately cancelled. Since then, Final Fantasy XI was kind of in this weird limbo, with no new content and no clear direction on where it is going next. Now with Voracious Resurgence and its currently ongoing episodic releases, it is clear from FF11 players that the story is gearing up for something grand in the end. And to be honest, this direction seems all too familiar. The new and sudden episodic installment for Final Fantasy XI, which was implemented last year, is very reminiscent to the transition between Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 to A Realm Reborn, and also recently Rhapsody's of Vana'diel to the cancelled mobile remake back in 2015. When the decision was made to remake Final Fantasy XIV, episodic story content was released, which eventually led up to the grand finale of Final Fantasy XIV 1.0. Soon after, a press release was made alongside a trailer that announced the upcoming Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn. The story content transitioning Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 to A Realm Reborn was progressive, in a sense that it was done to introduce a new story while putting an end to an old one, which is very similar to what Voracious Resurgence is doing in Final Fantasy XI. Compared to Rhapsody's of Vana'diel, which sought to conclude the story for Final Fantasy XI, Voracious Resurgence clearly indicates that it plans to begin a brand new one. So with that information and predicting a trend that we've seen with Final Fantasy XIV, it is safe to say that Final Fantasy XI is getting a reboot to some capacity, but what could it be? The current market and generation suggests that not everyone will want to pay a subscription service to play an almost 20-year-old MMO. With Final Fantasy XI's overall gameplay being very outdated, it barricades the game to new players even further. With that said, for the first option, in order for Square Enix to combat against this barricade and usher in new players, Final Fantasy XI could even get a remake as a single-player retelling of the story, or even a single-player sequel that continues what Voracious Resurgence may suggest. I don't think Final Fantasy XI is going to get a remake in the same potential as Final Fantasy VII Remake, but it could get a remake in the same tone and gameplay as, let's say, Bravely Default 2 or even Octopath Traveler, just two fun examples to mention. If they were to remake Final Fantasy XI into a single-player game, it will definitely immortalize the game into the mainline roster, and I'm sure many people will buy it, including those who didn't have the chance to play Final Fantasy XI when it was first released. The second option is that Final Fantasy XI could get the A Realm Reborn treatment and be rebooted as a current generation MMO with a complete overhaul in gameplay mechanics. This option can be very likely, and it's also something that was highly speculated before, but also could be very upsetting to players who enjoy the nostalgic elements that Final Fantasy XI already possesses. If Square is to give Final Fantasy XI the A Realm Reborn treatment, they could even adhere to core gameplay mechanics but just bring the game into the current generation. The third option is that Final Fantasy XI ties into the world of Hydaelyn, or possibly another shard. This option also seems very unlikely, and it will only offer familiarity of Final Fantasy XI to FF14 players, but nothing for current FF11 players and the game's revival, which renders Final Fantasy XI into only two options: remake the game as a single-player retelling or sequel, or reboot the game to current gen, receiving the Realm Reborn treatment. It is also worthy to note, Yoshida, the producer of Final Fantasy XIV, has stated that after Endwalker, he predicts the game will have at least 3 years left in its popularity. This could mean that Square Enix could potentially get started on another Final Fantasy MMO, depending if subscribers for 14 begins to die down, and if that was the case, there will be 3 Final Fantasy MMOs competing with each other on the market. And if any of you watched my previous videos, you will know that I've stated before that based on observation, Square Enix does not compete with its titles. As a former Final Fantasy XI player, FF11 actually being my first MMO back in 2003, I will love to see the game rebooted to current generation gameplay and just relive that experience all over again, or even just to continue that experience as a next-gen installment like what A Realm Reborn was for Final Fantasy XIV 1.0. However, as some of you already know, I like to make sound and speculations based on logic and making predictions based on business models, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm right or will even be correct. I personally think Final Fantasy XI is gearing up for a single-player retelling of the story, or even a sequel as a single-player game. If Square Enix wanted to reboot Final Fantasy XI as a current-gen MMO, they would have done so already, but instead, once upon a time, they agreed to collaborate with Nexon to produce a mobile remake, which is a strong indicator that there wasn't a 10-year plan for the game in building the infrastructure for a possible updated MMO. If they wanted to immortalize Final Fantasy XI in the mainline titles, a single-player retelling or sequel seems to be the most logical decision. And with Final Fantasy XI's 20th anniversary coming up in 2022, and the direction that Voracious Resurgence is currently heading in, we could get an announcement of their next plan for Final Fantasy XI next year. As it currently stands, Square Enix's lineup for 2022 and 2023 is completely full, which means that if any new Final Fantasy XI game was to be released, we wouldn't see it until anywhere from 2024 or even 2026. Comment below and let me know what you think. Do you think Final Fantasy XI could transition into a single-player game of some sort, or do you think it is still possible for a rebooted MMO? If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more Final Fantasy XI content on this channel. Thanks for watching, and see you all next time.